Recording is in progress. It's your stage. Oh. Michael, your micro is turned off. Sorry.
Is that better?
Now it's better, yes.
Good. So thank you, Chris, for your introductions and giving us the opportunity to speak today. And thank you to all of you for joining us and spending time today. It's been very exciting to see your messages coming from all over the world saying hi. So hi to you all. So I'm based in the UK, and later on you're going to meet my supporting presenter, René. But as Chris has said, I'm going to start presenting now, and please send in any Q&As to René, and we'll try to deal with those towards the end of the session. So first of all, some acknowledgements, very important. So the foundations for this work are from a wonderful lady in South Africa called Lynn Mellis, and she in turn built her knowledge based on this pioneering research by Professor Sylvia Downs. That's a reference to her book, which unfortunately is out of print now. We have had some great help from Matthew at PPI with our graphics, so thank you to Matthew. We would like to encourage you to share this material, so we hope there's some information here that you like, and if so, we hope you'll share it, but please do take note of our copyright statement. So with any learning event, there should be some clearly stated objectives up front. So our objective is that we hope you take these messages away at the end and hope maybe some more as well. So this sets the frame for our talk today. And the structure of our talk is, hopefully you can see here, approximately 40 minutes presentation mode and then 15 minutes Q&A mode. Now, the fundamental part of our talk today is based on these four sections: principles, progression, growth, and propagation. So you might like to see that as a life cycle for learning. So principles is more about what we learn and how we learn it. Progression is about how much progress do we make in our learning? How can we measure our improved maturity in our learning? And growth follows a learning event. So we might all go to a learning event, but we hope then we plan to build on that and put it into practice and develop that new knowledge even further. So that's growth. And lastly, we'll talk about propagation, which is having been to a learning event. We hope you'll feel excited to share that with other people and propagate your knowledge within your organization or your business. So, but before we get to those four main themes, there's some introductory context, a few slides on introductory context. So first of all, learning is a social activity. We learn with others and everyone has a role to play in that process. So whoever's in that process has something to contribute as well as something to learn. So a real learning environment will encourage all that knowledge sharing. Now, you might be used to maybe an old-fashioned notion that we go on a training course, but training is perhaps presenter-focused, whereas a much more powerful concept is that learning is delegate-focused. And a very important point is that anybody can become a better learner if they understand the learning principles and if they understand how to apply those principles. For the purpose of this presentation, we've come up with a few definitions. This was actually a little bit tricky because actually a learning facilitator who runs the learning event is also a learner, because every time we do a course as a facilitator, we learn a lot from the delegates. So it's a bit tricky to get these definitions, but that's what we've done for this presentation. A few little points before we move on. So there are considered to be three main ways of learning. So we memorize facts, we understand concepts, and then we really learn when we start to apply that knowledge in a real application. And what's great about a learning event is it's a safe space in which to get things wrong. And we often learn a lot when we get things wrong. If it's done in a safe space, in a supportive way, then that can be a powerful thing. And in fact, quite often if we get things wrong a few times, then we have what René describes as a light bulb moment. And that's something we remember for a very long time. Oh yes, it suddenly clicked. And now I realize what you've been talking about for the last 3 hours. It's very important to try and find ways of mixing and matching different approaches to learning. So there are many different approaches to learning, and we should try and mix and match those and have some variety. And different people learn in different ways, and we need to be sensitive to that and actually benefit from our understanding of that. And in this interaction, questioning what's being put to us, contrasting that with other things, challenging, debating and discussing. So in fact, the very opposite of a passive approach is what's going to really help us in our learning. And thinking through, well, I've just been learning something here now. How does that going to work at work? How can I apply that at work? How can I make this real? How can I turn this ivory tower into something of practical benefit to me at work, or maybe at home, maybe a home extension? So it's not all about work. I forgot to say at the beginning, the title of this presentation was How to Learn Systems Engineering or Anything. So of course, today it's in the context of systems engineering, but everything in here is generic to learning anything. So we've now got two contrasting context models. So the first one on the left-hand side is, if you like, maybe an old-fashioned appreciation of what we mean by training. It's very transactional. So we pay a trainer to download some knowledge. But what we would aspire to in a much richer understanding of learning is a learning environment where the facilitator and the delegate come to that event with existing knowledge, theoretical knowledge, and with existing experience of applying that knowledge. And the questions and the answers and the discussion are very much bidirectional and interactive and mutually supportive. The feedback and support equally is bidirectional. What might be less obvious to people but it's absolutely true, is that quite often as a facilitator, I get support from the delegates, which might be a surprise, but it's true. So all of these relationships are bidirectional. And we now extend this diagram to where there's more than one delegate. And a very important point is that everybody in that event learns from everybody else in that event. The delegates each have different experience, and that discussion around those differing experiences is a very powerful learning tool. So the first main section of our talk today is about principles, and there are 10 principles. Now at the bottom, we've got a little roadmap, so it's a progress bar from 1 to 10. This actually illustrates our first principle, that learners need to know where they're going, and they need a roadmap, they need a sense of progress towards those objectives. And what's not so apparent from this principle is that, and perhaps it's even more important, is that learners must be involved in setting the objectives from the outset. There must be a handshake on the learning objectives for this planned event. So as an example of that, maybe somebody comes on one of our courses and says, I want to learn the handbook, and that might be their objective. And I'd have a chat with them and I say, well, actually, really what you're going to learn in 5 days is you're going to learn how to read the handbook. You're not going to learn the handbook, you're going to learn how to read the handbook. And that's an important thing in having a handshake about the objectives for that event. Now, I'm going to be a bit unkind here, but it's true that quite often people don't send us their objectives in advance. And so therefore, if I'm being unkind, they don't really know what course they're coming on, and they discover on the Monday morning what course they're coming on. And I always start an event with a discussion of objectives and try and get that sorted out. I did have one gentleman who came to my course, and when we'd finished writing down the objectives, he said to me that, oh, I'm on the wrong course. I should be next door learning about circuit board design. So that was quite handy. Let's move on now. So they must have a roadmap of some kind. And here's an example of a roadmap that we might have for a course around the Systems Engineering Handbook, where we have all these different processes to learn. And I won't go into detail today. I'll just give you a quick overview of this diagram and why it's useful, really. So the vertical green bars represent the steepness of the learning curve for each specific chapter or process area in the handbook. And there's quite a lot of variation. So some are quite difficult to learn and others are very quick to learn. Whereas the blue line is a generic learning. And this is about learning how to use the handbook. So to start with, people may not have any idea how to use the handbook, and they gradually build confidence in understanding how the handbook works as they go through our course. And just in case you're wondering what this cross is, this allows me to explain another of our principles that we will come to. So as it happens, these two green ticks represent verification and validation. And we like to present verification and validation jointly and focus people on answering the question, what are the differences and what are the similarities between verification and validation? That's a very useful learning approach to compare and contrast. So that means that we've skipped one of the process areas at this point in our course. So if you think you know what process corresponds to the X, then you can put it on the chat line. So moving on, that's an example of a roadmap for a course. We must have a learning environment where people feel comfortable in sharing. And a fairly classic way of doing this is to start the course with a charter or something along those lines. And an expression I'm sure you're all familiar with is you might say something like, what we say in the room will stay in the room. So people feel safe in being open about what's going on in their working environment. Third principle, very important. So the primary accountability for learning lies with the learner. So the more proactive you are and the more you believe in this principle, the more effective your learning will be. And again, this is something you could make clear before the event. And you might send out something, you might call it a briefing kit, and send it to people and share it and talk to people. And maybe share the idea that we're in a learning system and that delegates are learning from each other. So that people have maybe a different perspective about what this event is all about and how to get the most benefit from the event. Principle number 4. Active participation. So in general, communication is bidirectional, or as a minimum, it's bidirectional. There's a speaker and a listener. And we suggest that each party is 100% responsibility for has 100% responsibility for effective communication. So it's not 50-50, it's 100-100, which incidentally is maybe something to consider for a marriage. So both parties to a marriage should be 100% responsible for the success of that marriage. And it's the same for communication. So for a bit of fun, I came up with a hypothesis. And this is something I believe to be true, but I haven't researched the data. That we always get feedback from our courses and our events. And I'm quite convinced myself, but I can't prove it academically, that the satisfaction score correlates to delegate engagement, the degree of engagement. In other words, I tend to get high scores from the people that interact the most. That's nothing I've done, that's what they've done. They've engaged more and therefore they've got greater course satisfaction or satisfaction with the overall event. So I had a bit of fun and sketched out what I thought these graphs might look like. And maybe you've got an idea what the graph looks like, and maybe you think one of these makes more sense. But I quite like number 2 because it is occasionally, not very often, but occasionally one particular delegate may want to take too much airtime and may constantly be trying to ask questions and get the attention of the room on that person. So somehow that needs to be managed by an experienced facilitator. So it is possible, I think, that you could have too much engagement. And so this is an example of tailoring, where we need to get the right amount of delegate engagement for the optimum outcome. Number 5, very important. Learning isn't an ivory tower. People need to see how they can put it into practice and how it relates to their existing experience and knowledge. So if you want to play to this principle, you might think of a workshop along the following lines. So look at this process in your own experience, and this might be done in pairs, by the way, so that people can share their different experiences. When was this process done well? When could it have been done better? What can we learn from that? What steps should we take to reinforce the good practice and avoid the less good practice? And here's another idea, is to use a well-known item or system that provides a thread through a number of workshops. So for example, if we pick this bicycle, we could talk about the configuration management of the bicycle. We could talk about requirements for the bicycle. We could write a systems engineering management plan for the bicycle. And so the same thing would crop up in a number of different workshops. And it's something tangible that most people can relate to. And number 6, learning is a good thing, but actually we can proactively choose to build on our learning skills. Again, try not to be passive. So learning is a set of tools and techniques. So let's proactively go about trying to improve our capability in learning. So read about learning, identify which methods work for you, and monitor your progress on a learning curve. So for some strange reason, learning reminded me of a book called where there's a character called Major, and this is learning. And you might choose to put the 10 principles on a radar plot. And blue is where you think you are currently. Have a really simple, pragmatic way of scoring this. It doesn't have to be a precise mathematical thing, just a pragmatic way of working out where you think you are, where you want to be in the next 6 months, which is probably not a 5 on all scores. So be pragmatic and think where you want to be in the next 6 months, and then address how you're going to build your experience and your skills with these different principles. Now, the radial distance could be how often you apply the skills. Alternatively, it might be how well you apply the skills. And if you want to measure how well you apply the skills, you might want to use something like Bloom's taxonomy, which we're going to talk about shortly. An interesting note I've got here is a quote from somebody called Ulrich Boser, and he says that people who learn how to learn can outperform those with very high IQs. So being brilliant is good, but really taking care about learning how you learn is potentially more powerful. Number 7, have a different mix and different styles and different approaches to learning. To remember, in a typical learning environment, there are a number of different people there potentially, but also one individual may prefer one learning approach one day and a different one the next day, and certainly variety is a good thing. So when you're designing a learning event, which you might be doing for yourself, by the way, not for somebody else, try and achieve a mix of different learning approaches. And here are some of the techniques you might want to consider. And articulating concepts is really powerful. So if you have to write something down and then explain that to somebody else, really capture it really clearly in such a way that you can explain it to somebody else, that really shows you've understood that material. So articulation is really good. Looking for keywords, I mentioned compare and contrast. Analyze, well, any video, but people seem to enjoy disaster videos. A bit of Schadenfreude goes a long way. So yeah, analyzing disaster videos or something like that. Strengths and weaknesses, obviously answering questions, but what is also very powerful is to get delegates to write their own questions. It's much, much harder to write a question than it is to answer one. You really have to understand the material well to write a good question. Do role play. Well, I like role play, but I tend not to tell people they're going to do role play because a lot of people hate the idea of role play and they shy away from it. They think it's scary stuff. But so I'll do role play, but I won't tell them they're going to do role play, and then they really enjoy it. So role play is really good. What's else? Reporting back on a case study, for example, brainstorming, drawing diagrams. Yeah, diagrams are really good. Let's not do everything in text and grammar, and let's do some diagrams. That's really good. Or do a balloon race, which is always a bit of fun, but also powerful as well as fun. So why not have some fun when we're learning? Potentially we'll be there for quite a number of days, so we'll try and have some good fun whilst we're learning. I've already mentioned this one a few times. So create the safe space where people can get things wrong. And compiling your own exam questions is one example of, excuse me one moment. Right, so yeah, compiling your own exam questions is good because if you get those wrong, you can learn from that with effective guidance. Leading me on to number 9, because these two are actually coupled principles. So if you're going to get things wrong, then you need objective, constructive feedback, which is done well. So the feedback must be aimed at the idea, not the person. And we must provide an opportunity to try again. So here's an example where the delegate is asked to write an exam question for the systems engineering knowledge exam. And this is their first attempt. So the facilitator looks at that and said, well, actually, the questions should never be posed in the negative. So have another go and see what you come up with. And so this might be the second attempt where the question is now posed in the positive sense. So a simple example, but a very important principle. And we must vitally allow time for reflection during the event and certainly at the end of the event. So here's an illustration of how that might work. You might have a worksheet at the end of the day for a learning event, and there might be 4 key questions for people to reflect on and think about. What are your learning points from today? So they've got to go back through that material and pick out their top 3 or 4 learning points. Have you thought about how you could apply this in your workplace or at home? How are you going to use this new knowledge? How are we doing in terms of progress against objectives? And how could we improve the learning event for tomorrow? They're very important questions, and people have time, must be given time, maybe even half an hour, to think about these things and feedback to the facilitator and to share with the other delegates and discuss what's happened today. It's been a long day. What's happened? What do we do tomorrow? So in summary, those are the 10 principles. So this sheet might be useful to you. This list might be useful to you for future reference. Right, 30-second pause while you think about all that, and then we'll move on to progression. So far, I've talked about what we're learning and how we're learning it, but now we need to talk about performance, which is saying how well have we learned it. So it's a little bit like the difference between a functional requirement and a performance requirement. How well have we learned this new material, and how are we going to assess that progress during the event? Very important that this performance view should be considered when defining the objectives of the event. So of course it's very common for people to talk about what are we going to learn on the event? And I find it's less common for them to talk about how well are we going to learn it, which of course is more tricky to do in a way. So there might be a framework, you might have a framework to do this, but here's one that we rather like called Bloom's taxonomy, which I'm sure many of you have come across this. So it's well known and well used. And we have these 6 levels. So starting at the bottom, we might be able to remember something, not having thoroughly understood it. Moving to the next level, now we understand it, that's more powerful, and that's a good place to be. But the 3rd level is apply. So now we're so confident in this new knowledge that we're going to apply it confidently and effectively. So a bit of an analogy to this is that in order to achieve the ASEC certification in INCOSE, you need to pass the knowledge exam, which means you need to be able to remember and understand the material in the handbook. Whereas for the CSAP certification, you need to give evidence that you've applied that knowledge. So there is a way of, if you like, of relating the ASEP and the CSAP to this particular taxonomy. And you can see how, as you go up to the top of the pyramid, we build and build on the power of that knowledge to the point where we're now creating brand new knowledge based on what we learned in that learning event. So that's something to consider. How are you going to characterize the depth of your knowledge, and how can you use that to set up the objectives for the event in the first place and measure success against those objectives at the end of the event? Moving on now to growth. So we've all been to a learning event and we celebrate the end of the learning event. What happens after that? Does it stagnate? Do we immediately get into the forgetting curve? Or do we actively seek to build on that through structures such as continuing professional development and the INCOSE competency framework? So I expect many of you are familiar with the INCOSE approach to CPD. But I think most professional bodies have something like this. This is the INCOSE approach to CPD. And if you're engaged in this, then congratulations, you can get a merit for attending this event. So that is perhaps more aimed at the individual, whereas the larger framework, the systems engineering competency framework, is looking at perhaps more of an enterprise or a business. What is the competency in that collection of individuals who may or may not individually be certified within the INCOSE program? So the last of our main themes today is propagation. So how can we share this knowledge with other people who maybe couldn't participate in that event? And of course, most organizations can't afford to send everyone to a learning event. And if they do, then it might be called a sheep dipping exercise. So those people who do go, we suggest, must feel accountability for compounding that benefit after the learning event. And there's a model here which I was more than rather like. I really like this model by an author called John Maxwell. And it's a coaching model. So to start with, I do it. So I'm the blue person here. I do it, whatever it is. And now I do it with you, you being the green person, and we're doing it together, but I'm coaching you, I'm leading you, I'm supporting you. But then after we get to a certain level of maturity, we switch. And the green person is now doing it with me as a facilitator. So now the accountability is switched in a very significant way, and I'm there to help if I'm needed, but really they're more or less ready to do it anyway. Then when we get to this point, this original blue coach is no longer required. This person is fully competent and trusted to exercise that new knowledge. So you do it, and that's great. But what's really powerful is that if that green person now does it with somebody else who's an orange person here. So we're spreading the knowledge through the organization, and a small number of people, if you like, they act as the seeds that create this propagation, can create a very powerful ripple through the organization if we have a model rather like this. But of course, it's not going to happen by accident. The organization needs to be determined to make this happen and to make it part of the plan and the culture of the business. So they're the main elements of our presentation today, but we did want to throw in a few practical tips. So first of all, cultural issues, very, very important. And it's something that everybody must be sensitive to. The facilitators and the delegates must be sensitive to any cultural issues that are going on in the learning environment. So here's some examples. The first one is true. I found this: some cultures, some individuals, some businesses actually hate doing workshops. And I have the experience. I went on a 5-day course, and at the end of Monday, I asked for the feedback. And they said, well, in our business, we hate doing workshops. For the remaining 4 days of the course, we want it to be like a university lecture. We just want you to lecture to us for 4 days. So this felt to me like a total disaster, and I had to spend all night rewriting the course. But it's something you have to be prepared to do, because you have to be prepared to work with the cultures of the people that are engaging with you. Number 2 is also something to be very careful about. So in some cultures, now this could be a country, it could be a business, it could be an individual, it could be related to the faith of the people in that team. But anyway, there might be a strong hierarchical power structure. And again, I've had this experience. So if we have an organization like this, and if the boss goes on the course and the reportee goes on the course, then the person that reports to the boss will not say anything in the class because they're scared of getting something wrong. And we've already said that people must be allowed to get things wrong in a learning environment, but in a power-based structure that doesn't happen, so nobody says anything. And equally, the boss, if they get something wrong, will certainly lose faith with their workers, so they don't say anything either. So the degree of interaction is quite low in some of these cultures. And number 3 is just an example. Hopefully it might make you smile. So I'm on a downward slope in my country, but if I go to another country, I might be seen as a very wise person because I'm very old. So that's just an example, but of course you can think of many other examples, and it's something to think about carefully and discuss with everybody involved in the event. Pair working, very powerful. So always on a course, there will be people who are naturally don't like coming forward and speaking out in a big group. You always have people like that. But if you put people into pairs, then that usually goes away, and we're quite happy to talk to one other person and build their confidence. And actually, I found that people like that when they've been in pairs for a while and it's built their confidence, they feel more encouraged and able to talk in a slightly bigger group. If you're going to do pairs, then it's a good idea to rotate those pairs, because then you get exposed to a whole range of different ideas and a whole range of different people. What people might not have thought about, and I always encourage people, if you're revising for an exam, try to do that in pairs. It's pretty boring sat in your own study trying to learn a book. So try to do it with somebody else and engage and do it as a pair and help each other. It's much more effective and interesting way of learning something. So there is a technique that people often use called a flashcard. So on the flashcard, we have the question on one side and the answer on the other side. It doesn't have to be done in pairs. You can do this with yourself, but again, if you can do it in pairs, it's even better. So if you know the answer to this question, you can put it on the chat line, not the Q&A. And if you don't know the answer to this question, then you're not going to get your Incosi certification. So the answer to the question is 42. And patterns. Patterns are a really powerful way of learning things. And in fact, even if something doesn't fit the pattern, that can be a really powerful cue to your brain, because then you have to think, well, why doesn't it meet the pattern? Is there a good reason for that or a bad reason for that? Actually, it doesn't matter as long as it helps me to learn it. An example of this, in the Incosi handbook, we have these diagrams called Ipo diagrams, inputs and activities and outputs. And the outputs often look like this. So at the top, if the process is called X, we'll have an X strategy. And at the bottom, we'll have an X report and an X record. So imagine this process was decision management. Then at the top, we'd have decision management strategy. At the bottom, we'd have decision management report and record. Now that pattern holds up quite well for quite a lot of processes in the handbook. And in fact, these outer work products are to do with the machinery of the process. So you could look at those as overheads, if you like. And the inner work products are the added value of the process. So again, a pattern like that can really help you to learn things. So we're in section 7 of our talk now, which is reflection. So I'm going to stop talking for a while, and in accordance with principle number 10, we're going to apply that to this webinar, and we'd welcome some feedback. And also it's good for you if you have a bit of time to reflect. So maybe 2 minutes, if you like to put your top 1 or 2 learning points on the chat, we'd welcome that. So I'm going to go quiet for a couple of minutes whilst you exercise principle number 10. Okay, well, I think I'd better move on. And this means that it's over to René. So René, would you like to take over and guide us through, please, the questions and the Q&A session?
Sure. Firstly, thank you everyone for your attention and the great discussion in the chat. It's really lovely to see. Because I think we have enough time, I'm actually going to read the questions that weren't posted in the Q&A. I think we can answer them all. So Reese posted this question before you actually got to Bloom's taxonomy, Michael, but potentially there's still something else to unpack there. The question is, how does your learning life cycle chart map, if at all, to Bloom's taxonomy of learning, i.e. evaluation, synthesis, analysis, all the way to knowledge? Is there a relationship there?
I'm sorry, René, I don't know where to find this question. Is it in the Q&A or in the chat?
This one is in the chat. And would you like me to repeat it a bit more?
No, I think I've got it. It's okay. I just confused myself because I couldn't see it. So if I could just temporarily escape from presentation view. Are you still seeing my screen? So if I just go back and stop sharing, and I want to pull up the relevant slide to help me answer the question. So give me a second to do that. Okay, so if I reshare now, I hope you'll see the relevant slide. Is that showing up properly? So this is the overall structure for our course. I think the question is about how does Bloom's taxonomy relate to this? What I've suggested is a learning life cycle. So I'm thinking about that on the fly. I haven't thought about it before. It's a very good question. And I think there must be a relationship. And I better stop there. The relationship I was explaining was mainly about the amber portion of growth. So I was speaking that I would primarily think about Bloom as measuring growth on a learning curve. But I'm afraid it's a bit complicated for me to answer straight away in terms of how to relate that to the whole of our presentation and this suggested life cycle. It's a very good question.
Yes, it is a great question. And one thing I was thinking about is, would you say that the steps of within this learning progress chart, are these linear steps? Because I'm thinking you can execute multiple levels of the Bloom's taxonomy in learning, but would you say that you can be in multiple phases of learning according to this chart? Because perhaps there is like a matrix of sorts, a mapping that one could plot with what level of depth they'd like to cover by what point, because we are increasing our depth of learning as we go through the cycle itself.
Yes, I'm sure that's true. But I think that if you can think of something called a nugget of learning or a piece of learning, then I think each nugget of learning will have its own little life cycle and its own progress on the Bloom's framework. But I suppose to be practical about it, you could measure the growth on each of the declared objectives for your learning event. So let's say you had 5 objectives for your learning event, then it would certainly be practical to apply Bloom's to that. But to try and apply Bloom to 100 different things might become a massive overhead.
Excellent, thank you. And now I'll move to the Q&A. So thank you guys for posting questions, and please do keep them coming. We'll try to get through all. The next question is from Ty. What is a balloon race?
Yes, so I can illustrate this. So you imagine that 6 or 7 people are in a hot air balloon, and they might all be examples of specialty disciplines. So we might have a safety engineer and a cosmetics engineer and an EMC engineer and a mass properties engineer all in the balloon. And they're all, which is synonymous for a project. So we're all on this project, but we can't afford to employ all of these people. So one of them's got to jump out the balloon. So which of these specialty disciplines should jump out of the balloon? So that always raises some interesting discussions in a live event. So if, for example, we said that the EMC engineer should jump out because we can't understand them, the EMC engineer might jump out the balloon, and then a few minutes later there might be a lightning strike. The balloon wasn't designed for lightning strike, so everybody's gone anyway. Would you like to try another question, René?
Yeah, sure. The next one is from Reese. What suggestions do you have for people to maximize the learning that they extract from attending webinars?
Well, that's a good question, because I think within the webinar, it's slightly artificial compared to the aspiration that I put up originally in my context diagram. The aspiration was that you'd have rich mechanisms for all of the interaction between facilitators and delegates. And I think with a webinar, there are naturally some constraints on that, and it's a very short period of time. So I haven't done this exercise, but if you looked at the 10 principles for learning, then you could probably tick off the ones that work well in webinars and tick off the ones that don't work so well in webinars, and think about how to address those gaps.
Excellent. And I think it relates to one of the principles that we had, and certainly to the overall theme of taking responsibility for learning. A great exercise is to figure out what kind of learning style you have. So I think it's audio, visual, kinesthetic, and auditory digital, which is basically when you need to say something back to yourself in order to get it. So once you figure that out, you might learn that it's beneficial to have, for example, the transcription up, if you're someone who prefers the auditory digital style. So there are lots of online quizzes, and it's very helpful for me. I actually am quite visual, so now I know that that's the best form for me to take information in, for example.
So for myself, I learn by writing something out with an old-fashioned pen with ink in it. I don't learn from typing. But my son is the opposite. So yeah, each person should identify what works best for them.
I agree. The next question is from Gina, and I'll try to answer this one.
Oh, good. Have fun.
She asks, interesting comment about negative questions. Can you elaborate on this concept? For example, why not use negative questions? So specifically, that point came up when we were talking about providing feedback on the questions that delegates write, for example, as part of our preparation for being able to tackle the Incompetence knowledge exam, which consists purely of multiple choice questions. And the premise of the Incompetence knowledge exam is that they try not to let language be a bigger barrier than it needs to be in the ability to assess whether you understand the content of the handbook or not. So that's just one of the principles that they use for constructing questions. You will not see a question in the exam that's got, which you should not, and typically don't, that's got a negative in it, because it could kind of cause confusion, especially for people who aren't first language English speakers. Okay, next question. This one's from Jason. What do you suggest to make systems engineering learning engaging and effective for you, Michael?
Well, I like the expression, have some serious fun. That's my expression. So especially if it's like a 5-day course, that's tough for people. And if it is the systems engineering handbook, that's pretty dry material. So how do you make that dry material exciting? So it's a question of thinking about these different learning styles and having a mix of different learning styles, so everybody gets at least some of the learning styles they prefer will crop up from time to time, and get people to interact and have fun. And even if they say they hate role play, for example, don't make a big issue of it. Do some role play and have some fun. Have some mini competitions. So I sometimes, if I've got people, two teams in a room, I'll set up a competition, and people love a competition. Yeah, so I hope that's a reasonable answer. I'm sure there's more I could think about, Jason.
Excellent. Thank you. Oh, okay. The next question. Okay, this one's from Julian, and I'll try to answer this one. When it comes to learning performance, would you say or not that there is a correlation with the size of the learners group or audience? I'm interpreting that as, do you mean like this, does the size of the class that's come together affect the effectiveness of the learning? And I would say generally yes, although it is quite a wide range. So two people learning together with a facilitator can put a little bit too much pressure on either of them. So if there's 3 or more, it can make for a more relaxing environment. I would say about 3 to 20, with the optimal being about 5 to close to 20 actually works quite well. Again, it might be affected by the culture within the organization or amongst the team. It's interesting because you tend to find that there's actually the most interaction around the 10 to 12 people range. It's almost like when the class is too small, people feel too shy to speak, and similarly when it's too big. So it is quite strange how it works out in practice, but I would say definitely yes, and it's about figuring out what works for you. Okay, awesome. Next question is from Lucas, Michael, and this one is for you. What would a single presentation slide look like if you were to summarize the SE handbook for a 10-minute seminar talk to an audience ranging from 0 to expert level knowledge about SE? I'm glad I'm not doing that one.
Well, that's a very challenging question. So I've tried it for a half-hour seminar. That was tough. 10 minutes is even tougher. So what would it look like? Well, that would be quite an accomplishment if you could do it, but I'd be happy to try it. I can't visualize what it would be like at the moment, to be honest, but I have tried to convey the primary purpose and structure of the handbook in a 30-minute seminar talk. I think with some success.
I'm happy to take on the challenge with you, Michael, and see what we can put together and perhaps share it on our LinkedIn or something. That's like a really good question. Thank you.
Are we able to get back to Lucas after the event?
I'll try. And could you maybe navigate back to the last slide with our contact details, just in case we.
That's a good idea. Yes. Okay. One moment.
I would propose that communication is key. So for me, if I have to summarize system engineering in one slide, get people together and talk about it. It's simple, but it's, for me, is the solution.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you. Okay, a question from, there we go. A question from Angela. For you, Michael, how do you suggest balancing online, on-demand learning with the social and engagement aspects of learning?
Sure. So over the last couple of years, we've had to find ways of making online learning effective. So there are some things that work better face-to-face, but actually we haven't found too many negatives with the online platforms. I suppose we have to work harder at helping those interactions, but with the tools we have around us, they're mostly pretty good at helping people to have these interactions. And in some respects, I found some benefits with the online platform, just in terms of corralling everybody together and getting them there on time. So of course, it's far more efficient in terms of money and carbon. And speaking for myself, I'm very keen to reduce carbon. So if we can do things online and make them effective, then that's great. But we have to think, I think we have to take care to find ways of stimulating these person-to-person interaction.
Great, thank you. Another question from Reese. What are the biggest challenges or mistakes that you see in those conducting presentations that purport to teach their audience something?
Maybe too much detail, maybe not setting up the objectives in the first place, so people have a different expectation of what it is they're supposed to be learning. And I suppose maybe either accidentally or unconsciously, we haven't thought through all of the 10 learning principles and tried to make the most of those learning principles in what can be a very small time slot. So some of these events might be 5 days, but some of them might be 1 hour. So if it's a 1 hour time slot, how can we make use of 10 principles in 1 hour?
Yes, sure. And I think that in a way you could kind of view the act of compiling the presentation as itself a learning event, and so establishing what the objectives would be and also making sure that your presentation style is well matched to the audience. You know, we're in a time where people are consuming information in such a different variety of ways, and some would prefer reading a lot of text extensively, and others would prefer a short video, and it's really about using the information adequately for the different contexts as well. What we do in a webinar would be different versus what we do in a YouTube video perhaps, or you know, a LinkedIn post or something like that.
I mean, speaking personally for me, I often find things are very academic because I'm a practitioner and I like to know how to apply things, but you know, other people might want an academic presentation. So I suppose one presentation, it's difficult to get it right for everybody.
Yes, sure. Okay, now a question from Gina. Any tips on making webinars more engaging or more enticing in order to maximize audience attendance? And I'll start with this one. So I think I've actually been researching a lot about how the inflection of your voice, how important that is. And we were actually kind enough that Christian helped us to see that our first draft of the webinar was actually too wordy. And I think that feedback goes a long way. So Michael generated the core of this content and I gave reviews. So if there is someone who you believe is good at presenting or has a lot of experience with that, getting feedback prior, practicing prior, using the tone of your voice to gain people's interest, giving some space for reflection. I'm sure you noticed that Michael did that a couple of times, because there is a limit to how much information we can take in at a certain point. So yeah, that's a great question. Michael, do you have anything to add?
No, I think it's just that the webinar is rather more constrained than some other methods of delivering learning. The webinar has some constraints, but it also has many benefits. So.
Exactly. And maybe we can ask you, Christian, if you'd like to add anything. Of course, you're the greatest, most experienced out of the three of us here.
Oh, thanks a lot. Just you have to see a webinar as incentive because you're interested in something. You get a little bit of background, and it's then your task to get more background and to collect more information, to ask people around. It's just an incentive. It's free of charge. Spend some time, get some information, get some deeper knowledge about things, what is ever possible in 40 minutes, and then go on in learning. Yeah, so just become a facilitator, not a delegate, something like this. It is like this, and we have to really to be aware that we just can transport a certain limit, just a limited information. That's all. Huh?
Exactly.
But you're doing very fine concerning all the stuff you presented.
Thank you very much. Okay, great. A question from Marcus, and this one is for you, Michael. How can you make someone unaware of their incompetence about SE and get them to start learning?
Okay, so I think we have some double negatives in here. So may I rephrase the question? How can you make somebody aware of their competence in systems engineering? So how can you help somebody establish what their degree of competence is? So the INCOSE Systems Engineering Competency Framework would be a great place to start. So that gives you an impression or a table, if you like, of the different skill sets and the different levels you might hope to achieve in those skill sets. And so with some facilitation, we could help somebody gauge where they are with reference to that competency framework. That's with respect to framework, but you could alternatively decide to do it with respect to the Systems Engineering Handbook or any other body of knowledge about systems engineering. So I think it's a question of working with that person and helping them to self-assess where they are on a particular framework of knowledge and identify where they want to get to, and then figure out how to close those gaps.
I like to underline this, yeah, just figure out where they are and where they want to get to. So where you are today, where you have been yesterday, and where you want to be tomorrow. And I think there is no such things like incompetence in system engineering. Everyone is competent, but they call it differently. The skills or the skills and the capabilities are just called differently. You might call it A, I call it business mission analysis. Just think about wording, but really, it's people I meet, they are much more competent than I do. I just highlight the problem for them. I just figure it out for them, and then we talk about the same thing using the same concepts.
Yes, so I truly believe that everybody is a systems engineer, even if they don't know it.
Marcus has a follow-on comment here that we've maybe interpreted a bit incorrectly. And he says he's got a boss who does not even know what SE is and wants him to understand how little he knows and make him start learning, to help him to start learning SE. And I think a good reference for that is probably the business case for systems engineering. Your boss is probably going to have a lot of business concerns over and above the technical concerns. And there are excellent studies that have been conducted with evidence from multiple projects of different systems engineering complexity that actually show that objectively systems engineering contributes a lot of value when executed correctly. And if you'd like, I'd be happy to send you a paper on that. It's short to read, but really paints a helpful picture.
Yeah, but the question is what the person is interested in what kind of value the person is interested in. You have to figure it out.
Yeah.
And then to address that specific value, it could be any value. It will be not the technical processes, I guess, will be something different. Yeah, but maybe.
Yeah, I suspect your boss is doing systems engineering, but they don't have a framework or a language that so they can articulate what they're doing in terms of systems engineering. So if you have the framework and language and help them to understand it in terms of systems engineering, then it will be less scary for them.
I agree. Okay, so it looks like we've got 3 more questions here. So let's start with Nicholas. Should we go to a university for systems engineering, or is it better to learn through outside of curriculum? Yeah, I'm happy for you to start answering, Michael.
I don't know a good answer to that. I think provided if it's a university, then provided the team at the university has real practical applications knowledge of how to apply the principles in a real world environment, I think it should be absolutely fine. So I think it's a question of which institution you go to and which people are part of that institution. And for me, I think the theory of systems engineering is all very good and it's very useful, but I want to know that people have actually applied it and they know how to put it into practice.
Yes, and I think I was fortunate that I had some systems engineering content in my undergraduate degree, although it was too late. It was in my final year, and it was just really not enough focus and attention to it. So, I mean, of course, it depends on the quality of the course itself. And, you know, like Michael says, like the curriculum and who's teaching it and all of that will make a difference. But I think that the best place to be introduced to it is definitely is definitely in university, if not before. The sooner the better, actually, at least systems thinking. But if your career or if your education was different, then you can learn a lot in, for example, a 5-day course. I mean, obviously that's what we do, and we know that a lot of people out there are doing it. It is effective as well. So there are good training providers out there. There are good universities out there. The main thing is that you have that intention to learn and can start applying systems thinking as soon as possible. Okay, Nathan, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, has a question. For you, Michael, what would be some topics to unlearn in order to master systems engineering? Also, is the learning framework sequential or should be more circular to enable continuous improvement?
Okay. Can I take the second question first? So is the learning framework sequential? So I assume that you mean this, what I christened a learning life cycle. So yeah, I think we should, clearly whatever we do, we should drive for continuous improvement. And I think maybe some knowledge goes out of date. And so what I should have put on the end of my life cycle, I should have put disposal on the end of the life cycle. So when knowledge goes out of date, what do we do about that? How do we now go and replace that with something that's far more relevant in today's environment? So there, by the way, there always is a natural forgetting curve, but perhaps we should also have a planned forgetting curve and think about a continually moving forward in our knowledge, and the knowledge base that's available to us is continually changing. So we might have learned quite a lot 5 years ago, but now there are new things to learn. So I would go for the circular model. The other question, I think there were 2 questions and I've lost one of them. Do you know what the other question was?
I think it was about what topics do you think one should focus on unlearning prior to learning SE?
What topics should be unlearned? Okay, diving straight into the solution should be unlearned. Most people, I think, are desperate to dive into the solution, so please unlearn that. And
things that don't work.
Spend some time in the problem domain. So I think the human race is very good at solving problems, but unfortunately, it's very good at solving the wrong problems.
But it's quite human that you start to unlearn things that you don't need or don't work out. So that's natural.
Yes.
Yeah. So they fade away. I don't think you can unlearn them, but just they fade away. You just take new things, new knowledge, put it together to concept and then experience. And if it works out, then you will remember it and improve it because it has a value to you. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't solve your problem, then the knowledge will fade away because you say it's unnecessary. So, but unlearning, this is some intention. I'm not doing intentionally unlearning.
Well,
I hope I don't do it, but maybe.
I think if you can identify some bad habits, then you can be determined not to use those bad habits in the future. Yeah. That's connected with the question.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I totally agree. I think just the process of seeking new information and learning things that bring benefit and results will help you to drop those things that have not. Like one of the expressions I like is that systems engineering is just the framework that you arrive at when you've burned yourself enough times. And I think it's very apt. Okay, last question here from Carsten, and then I'll hand over to you, Christian. So this question is, how do you see the way of learning or the learning principles will change in the future? Do we see some trends that we just don't apply at the moment? I'd like to answer this one first before I let you add, Michael.
That's great.
So,
thank you.
I think that, principles are implementation independent, and that in general, they shouldn't change according to the technology or the format or that's being used to execute them or to which they may be verified or validated against. But naturally, as we evolve and as we learn, so we can refine those principles and express them in a better way. Or I think I just find it kind of unlikely that the principles will be done away with completely, but it's possible to add them. But there's also like a cognitive limit to where it starts to drop off in terms of effectiveness. Like if you just have 5,000 principles of learning, that's going to be much less effective than 10, for example. So that's my initial thoughts. What about you, Michael?
Well, I was just thinking whilst you're talking that maybe 40, 50 years ago, I think these principles were set up based on an understanding of how the human brain works. So I suppose the question is, do we think the human brain will change over a period of 10 years or 100 years or 1,000 years? Because if the human brain changes, then presumably some of these principles will need to be modified or will need some additional principles. But assuming that a good job was done in the first place of characterizing the human brain, then I think they'll be quite stable.
I agree. Thank you so much. I think that's all the questions. And thank you for your attention. Over to you, Christian.